Alright, so over about the last couple of weeks, we have seen some absolutely massive protests taking place down in Peru in the aftermath of the ousting and arresting of the former president, Pedro Castillo, who I talked about a year ago on this channel when he successfully defeated the far-right fascist candidate Keiko Fujimori in their presidential elections and has been, ever since then, essentially obstructed and sabotaged from day one. And effectively what happened here, and we're going to get into this article from the New York Times breaking down some of the protests that have been taking place, some of the testimonies from the protesters themselves. Then I'm going to show you a little bit of actual direct testimony and videos of what these protests have been looking like, but essentially the backstory here, which is incredibly complex and convoluted, so I'm just going to give you a rudimentary rundown here, but basically what happened is you had this nominally left-wing guy, Pedro Castillo, who comes from a working class background, and he was a former teacher and a former union member, and this guy gets successfully elected to the office of the presidency. And keep in mind that this is a country in Peru that we're talking about here that has had, I don't know, something like 6 or 7 presidents over just the last 5 years, so they've already been engaged in rampant political chaos and turmoil for a long time now. But basically this guy, who was nominally left on economic positions and is sort of more far right, or at least right wing on social issues to some degree, he gets elected. The ruling class within Peru, the business elites within Peru, the far right within this country absolutely despise this guy. And so from day one, since the second that he took office, they have been obstructing everything that the people of Peru wanted him to do by successfully nominating him and giving him somewhat of a mandate for his agenda. They have been completely blocking it. They have been completely obstructionist and been trying to impeach him and remove him from office from the first second that he took this position. So that's sort of like the backstory of how we ended up here. Then it sort of escalated. You had, I think, the third impeachment attempt that took place, and I guess Pedro Castillo was looking at the numbers and he decided, okay, it's looking like they're going to be able to successfully remove me from office. And so he decided to come out and make a statement where he was basically saying, I am going to dissolve Congress as it stands right now, which, keep in mind, is dominated by the far right and the coalitions that are backed by the business elite within Peru. And he decided, I'm going to dissolve Congress, I'm going to temporarily rule by decree, and then we are going to try to begin the process of rewriting our constitution, which, as a reminder, was a constitution that was drafted by a coalition that was put together by Alberto Fujimori, who is related to Keiko Fujimori, who Pedro Castillo defeated in the most recent election. And they wanted to rewrite the constitution. They wanted to hold new elections for Congress. And basically it was like a series of different coup attempts that were happening all at the same time. You had the legislative coups that were trying to be attempted by the Congress that is led by the far right. Then you had Pedro Castillo, who recognized that situation and basically said, okay, I'm going to do a sort of self-coup here, keep myself in power, and dissolve Congress and do all the rest of that. So it's sort of a really complicated and convoluted background that's going on here. But I mean, at the end of the day, the basic rundown is that you have a guy who is nominally left-wing. He wants to empower the indigenous communities, the working class, the poor within Peru with his policies. The business elite, the right-wing government powers within this country don't want to see that happen, so they sabotage him the entire length of his administration, and then it culminates in this big showdown that has been happening where Pedro Castillo ends up losing. He gets arrested, he gets removed from office successfully by the Congress, and now you have this massive eruption in protests across the country from Pedro Castillo supporters, but also people who just might not even like Pedro Castillo, but also just have an absolute hatred for the way that the current Peruvian government is operated, and how volatile this entire situation is. So here from the New York Times, they say protesters in Peru demand justice for ousted President Pedro Castillo. So let's just go ahead and get into some of the details here. They say, outside a detention center at the foot of the Andes Mountains, a camp has formed in recent days with as many as 1,000 people traveling hundreds of miles to demand freedom for the highest profile detainee, their former president Pedro Castillo. They will stay until he is reinstated, said one supporter, Milagros Rodriguez, who's 37 years old, or until civil war begins. So again, pretty tense fucking things that are happening right now in Peru. They say Mr. Castillo, a former school teacher and union activist who promised to fight for the poor, is the man at the center of Peru's dizzying political drama, having been removed from office last week after he tried to dissolve Congress and create a government that would rule by decree. And within hours, he was under arrest, accused of rebellion, and his vice president was sworn into office. Now, Dina Boluarte is the 6th president in 5 years in a country reeling from a long history of high-level level scandals and deep divisions between its rural poor and urban elite. And one thing that I just want to say up front here is that there are plenty of people who are coming out and they're saying, okay, Pedro Castillo, he was corrupt, or at the very least, he was engaging in nepotism, and the people in his immediate inner circle were involved in direct corruption. Okay, maybe some of that is true. Maybe some of those allegations of corruption are somewhat true. But we're not talking about something that is like abnormal, or something where the right wing within this country is like having a principled stance against corruption or anything like that. I don't think that this was actually about corruption at a fundamental level. As you could see from, again, the beginning of his administration, they were trying to sabotage him and remove him from office from day one. So I don't think that this is like some principled stance against corruption or nepotism or anything else that he was engaged in or people in his inner circle were engaged in. I think that this is much more about removing somebody from power who was somewhat antagonistic towards, the business elites and the oligarchs within this country. And so that's why they wanted to have him removed. And just as a reminder here, the person who lost this election to Pedro Castillo, even before the election tallies were finalized and it was decided that he was going to successfully beat this person, Keiko Fujimori, who again is related directly to the former dictator of Peru, Alberto Fujimori. But I mean, she was immediately leading protests to annul the votes of Castillo's supporters, and she was calling on outside, actors, whether that, I don't know, be the CIA or some other nefarious actors, to get involved to remove him from power. So these are not people who are coming at this from a principled standpoint, to say the least. And whether or not some of the corruption allegations are true or not, I don't think that that's really what this is about at a fundamental level. But let's just go ahead and continue here. So again, they say he is a former teacher and a union activist, and he obviously decided to dissolve Congress and then was arrested. And they have his vice president now who's in power. And they say during a virtual court hearing televised live on Thursday, a judge ordered Mr. Castillo be kept in pretrial detention for 18 months while his case proceeds. And Mr. Castillo refused to appear at the hearing. And they say what started out as a relatively peaceful transfer of power, I mean, it seems more like it was just a sort of legislative coup that they had going on there, but they say it has quickly erupted into widespread violence that has left at least 16 dead, many of them teenagers, and led to attacks against the police, against police stations, courthouses, factories, airports, and a military base. There was one clip that I saw go viral, which was absolutely wild, where some of these protesters managed to get their hands on a police officer, and then they did this sort of like whole hostage exchange with the police in exchange for one of the protesters who had been arrested. It's a lot going on here, to say the least, but they say at least 197 civilians and more than 200 police officers have been injured in clashes, according to the country's ombudsman office, which in a statement on Thursday called on security forces to immediately cease the use of firearms and tear gas bombs dropped from helicopters, dropping tear gas bombs from helicopters and using live ammunition on some of these protesters here. Okay, so the state response to a lot of these protests has been pretty intense and pretty violent and pretty all-encompassing here. But they say the government has responded to the unrest by imposing a national state of emergency, suspending the guarantee of many civil liberties, including the freedom of assembly, which is just completely fucking unacceptable. And in an effort to quell the unrest, the new president has called for early elections for as soon as December of 2023, a move that Congress is debating. And again, keep in mind, this Congress is dominated by the far right wing within Peru. They say Mr. Castillo is a leftist from an indigent farming family in the Andean highlands who had never held office before becoming president last year. And while Peru enjoyed a long stretch of commodities-driven economic success that pulled millions of people from poverty earlier this century, that wealth failed to reach much of the country's poor, especially in rural areas that bear the brunt of Peru's chronic inequality. So, I mean, just a note here on this. I mean, first of all, this is an absolutely bizarre sentence that the New York Times here has strung together. A long stretch of commodities-driven economic success. Success for who exactly? They say it pulled millions out of poverty, but somehow that wealth failed to reach much of the country's poor. Okay, so again, they're sort of talking about like right-wing governments that have been in place in Peru and, neoliberalism that has been imposed on a lot of Latin American, South American, Central American countries, and how that doesn't actually end up lifting up people who are genuinely on the bottom rung of the ladder. But I mean, on top of that, there's kind of this interesting phenomenon that happens in a lot of Latin American countries which is sort of the diametric opposition to what happens in U.S. domestic policies, where here in the United States, we have a lot of right-wing people that are more rural, and the more rural you get, the more into like, sort of like farming areas that you get, the more right-wing people tend to vote, whereas in the big cities, you have a lot of like more liberal people or more left-wing people who tend to vote more like Democrat, right? But in Latin America, for the most part, it is the complete polar opposite of that, and we saw this in Brazil with Lula, we saw this with Pedro Castillo, we saw this with, Luis Arce in Bolivia. We've seen this across the board, as well as in Chile. It seems like in Latin America, there seems to be like a sort of reverse of that, where a lot of the more wealthy or middle-class people within the cities of a lot of these South American countries tend to skew actually more like towards the pro-corporate, pro-business elite, right-wing factions, and it's actually the indigenous people, it's the people who are living in the countryside, the farmers, they are the people who tend to support a lot of these more left-wing or self-identified socialist candidates. So just an interesting phenomenon that, contradicts to how we typically understand politics here in the United States. But they continue saying the protests over Mr. Castillo's removal grew so quickly, many demonstrators said, because whatever his misdeeds, he represented a voice of a swath of the population that has long felt marginalized by the elite. And they got a quote here saying, "I am against the fact that my children don't have the same opportunities as the upper class," said Delia Minea, who's 49 and who had traveled an hour by car to the camp growing outside the prison complex, bringing with her breakfast for dozens of strangers. So, solidarity to them and anybody else who's participating in this. But they say some supporters arrived at the detention center on December 7th, the day that Mr. Castillo was arrested, and since then more and more have shown up and turned the area into a village where some of the people are now living. And they say there is a community kitchen under a blue tent serving roughly 1,000 people per day, according to a volunteer cook, with donations of vegetables bulging from plastic bags all around him. And just beyond, donated mattresses are stacked at least 7 feet high, while handmade signs hang all around calling for Mr. Castillo's freedom. And they say protester after protester expressed deep anger at Congress and the national news media, which many called, quote, the mercenary press, all of which they claimed functioned as proxies for the wealthy. Kind of similar to what we have here with the, mainstream media here in the United States. But they say one woman bragged about setting fires in the street and overturning a car belonging to a journalist during the protest in Lima the day before, saying, "We're past negotiation." And they say nearly everyone interviewed said that they believed Mr. Castillo had been manipulated into trying to dissolve the government, and they say all of this was planned, Mr. Pando said, and the manipulators, he said, were the country's, basically oligopolies or oligarchs, in other words. So, again, I'm going to show you a little bit of what these protests look like. Here we have a couple of images here from protesters. These are sort of the indigenous flags within Peru, similar to the exact indigenous flags that we've seen in Bolivian protests as well. Seems like you got some, rainbow, maybe pride flags there, and some Peruvian flags. Just a couple more pictures here. So yeah, you're seeing thousands and thousands of people who are taking to the streets in order to protest all of this clusterfuck of an unfolding that we have seen. I got a video here lined up. Let's just go ahead and check in with this one real quick. Yeah, so again, as pointed out here by Manolo, he says, Peru goes on the 9th day of protests against the coup government. They can be heard chanting, "Congress will fall." It's becoming clear that early elections will not be enough to quiet the protests as the state of emergency continues. More military are deployed, leading to an average, of 1 death per day. But, again, you can see, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of people taking to the streets. I also got a video here real quick from the AFP on what some of these clashes have been looking like. So let's just go ahead and watch this one real quick.
Yo voté por Castillo. Prensa.
So, I mean, yeah, as you can see there, it seems like there's a significant amount of chaos that has been unfolding. We also had this as pointed out here by Nick Estes. He says police are violently attacking protests in Peru. We just got a little bit of a glimpse in that video that we just watched, but he says while corporate media has moved on from the legislative coup against Pedro Castillo, people taking to the streets are echoing the message of the disposed president. And they say here from Castillo News that protesters in Peru have 3 demands, and they are, number 1, closure of the right-wing Congress, number 2, new elections, and number 3, freeing Pedro Castillo. And again, I have a video here that I'll actually just link down below if you want to see a little bit more direct testimony from some of the people who are taking to the streets. But essentially, I mean, my analysis of this looks to be like you have a situation where you have a government that has been historically, at least through modern history, has been utterly dominated by the right wing, by, those who are in support of right-wing, in some cases fascist governments, like the one under Alberto Fujimori, who was responsible for setting up the current constitution that they have. And you basically have a situation where it's a country that has been historically dominated by multinational corporate interests, specifically the United States, and this goes for many other Latin American countries as well. But it looks like you have a leader like Pedro Castillo who rises through the ranks very quickly, somebody who wasn't really involved in politics beforehand. He's a teacher. He, comes from more of a rural background. He was a union activist. This guy gets elected, and granted, I'm not trying to take everything, off of his plate as if he didn't do anything wrong under his administration. I think that he definitely gave too much, if anything, to a lot of these far-right political leaders within Peru, and he basically conceded on a lot of different things that he probably shouldn't have, and in some sense sort of walked back a lot of the promises that he was running on when he was running his campaign back about a year ago. And it seems like that had the effect of somewhat demobilizing his base, somewhat making it a lot easier for this right-wing Congress to impeach him successfully and remove him from power and then have him elected. But I mean, basically, listen, a lot of people have been having the analysis that basically starts at the point where Pedro Castillo announces that he wants to dissolve Congress and then pretending as if that just came from nothing. It didn't come from nothing. This is a guy who, again, was elected on a bold left-wing economic populist agenda, and effectively he took office. From the moment that he took office, you had this massively right-wing skewed Congress that decided to sabotage his entire presidency. They tried to impeach him multiple different times and were unsuccessful the first couple of times. They didn't let him actually, push through or help him with the agenda that the, overwhelming majority of the country wanted him to go in and fight for. And basically, it got to the position where he was sitting back and he was trying to make the analysis or the calculus and saying, well, listen, I mean, if you guys aren't going to let me do anything, if you're going to keep trying to essentially use like your legislative powers in order to effectively coup my government multiple times, then, well, I'm just going to turn around and instead of just letting that process take place, I'm going to, try to dissolve Congress and hang on to power. But it looks like the military brass, it looks like the police, and it looks like the right-wing business elite, as well as the politicians who are in support of those business elite, effectively rallied against him, managed to impeach him, managed to remove him from power, and then have him arrested. So, I mean, we're definitely going to have to keep our eye on this and how this entire process unfolds. One other thing that I'll say is that it's very interesting that whenever you have like literally a dozen people take to the streets in Peru to protest their socialist government there, then all of U.S. media is surrounding that, and they're saying, oh my God, look at these brave freedom fighters, and this is probably the downfall of the Cuban government after all of these years. But you look at what the protesters are saying down in Peru and how they're trying to push back against what looks to be like a right-wing legislative coup against this president who was, going in with this mandate to actually materially improve people's lives. And granted, he had lots of, mistakes and maybe even some aspects of corruption within his government. But, I mean, you have a lot of people who are taking to the streets, and where is the response from the U.S. media? Where is the response from, the U.S. State Department that frequently praises a lot of like Cuban protesters and Chinese protesters and Iranian protesters? But then when it comes to indigenous people taking to the streets to try to fight for just basic life necessities and improving their own lives and maybe even defending Pedro Castillo to some extent, where is the coverage on that? Where is the emphasis on that? Where is the condemnation of all of these, police that are going out there and brutalizing protesters and killing? I mean, I saw upwards of, 17 or so from Democracy Now! Did a report on it this morning. I mean, we're talking about, multiple people who have been killed, multiple people who have, been injured in this process, potentially hundreds. And, it seems like we're just dealing with a situation where this country is fundamentally broken to some extent because of how their Congress is set up, because of how their Constitution is set up. And, again, this isn't a first for them in recent years. We're talking about like 6 different presidents over 5 years. So, I mean, clearly this is a country that is dealing with some very fundamental problems in terms of how their economy has been structured, dealing with the impacts of imperialism, dealing with the impacts of exploitation and far-right governance within this country. And clearly it seems like there's going to be a lot of attention that needs to be paid to in Peru over the next couple of weeks and months. So I'll keep you guys updated as we get more information coming out on this entire chaotic event that is seemingly unfolding right in front of us.
Everyone is saying good Politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying